Hello and welcome back to the Developing Solutions with Sitecore Print Experience Manager video training series. In this video, we'll be continuing some of the advanced PXM development concepts. So we're going to look at personalization here, and there are a few core concepts that you need to know. And the first is basically where that user profile is stored for that personalized information. Now, for Sitecore 8, there's actually two places. There's the Sitecore .NET membership provider, and you can access parameters within that user by going to the API sitecore.context.user. Second is for XDB contacts, you'll have additional information, certainly for logged in users, as well as for anonymous users. So you can actually do some information and tracking based upon that, and that is tracker.current.contact. And within both of these, there's a lot of information. So there's things like personas and goals and campaigns, as well as having custom information. And we're actually going to leverage that custom information. And we'll spend a few minutes looking at the launch Sitecore site. And one of the things that it does is it actually has a fair bit of personalization within the site. It actually does leverage all these things, personas and goals and campaigns. And for a fairly complex example, you could do something like determining a user's persona. So they may be a developer, and then using that information in order to set document parameters. So any document that is tagged with developer, load that into the PDF that you may generate. And that's one way you could use some of that persona information. We're actually going to use something a fair bit simpler. We want to keep this implementation simple. The underlying core concepts, however, for personalization in general in PXM are all the same. And so what we're going to be doing is reusing a custom field that they had added to that user profile, which is basically the ability to add favorites. So we're going to go through our launch Sitecore site, create a user, log in as that user, navigate through the site, and set some favorites. And that is stored in the sitecore.context.user under in the profile, and there's a favorites field that was created. And that basically just has a pipeline delimited list of the GUIDs of all those favorite articles. Now, the nice thing about a pipeline delimited list is we can throw that to a repeater, and the repeater will iterate through those items and build that personalized document on the fly. So we're going to do that, as well as a simple personalization, basically putting in the user's name at the top of that document. And so that's a simple implementation, but the core concepts of being able to work with that persona information, and then the ability to replace items based upon that data key within your PXM document, those are really the two halves that you need to understand and implement personalization. So let's go ahead and look at the launch Sitecore site now. Now I've gone ahead and I've logged in or tried to visit the publicly facing site just by accessing the URL without Sitecore, and I'm doing this in Internet Explorer so that I can continue to have my Chrome session logged into Sitecore itself. Now you're noticing here we are not seeing the launch Sitecore site, and that is because we have not done a publish yet. And so first step is obviously to go to the content editor and do a full publish, and that'll do a number of things. It's going to take all of our content and publish that out, as well as all of the presentation layer settings, and publish that out as well. So that's the very first step. You can do that from anywhere and just say publish site, and we're going to do a republish. This doesn't really matter performance-wise. It's going to be the same because, of course, we have none of this content in the web database. But we're going to go do that, and that's going to take a couple minutes. And then when we come back, we'll refresh this site and go through the process of creating a user, as well as adding those favorites to the user and looking at that user account within the Sitecore system. So we'll hit publish now and say OK and go to the end result. All right, so that content now has been published, so we'll close that. If we go back to Internet Explorer and refresh, we will now see the launch Sitecore site. Perfect. So that's exactly what we want to see. Now we're going to register and we'll create a user. And I'm going to navigate through a few articles here, and so we'll understand what is content. I'm going to add that to favorites, and that now appears here in the top right. And we'll pick a few other topics here. Something with images, yep, add that to favorites. And this is another good one, yeah, add all those to favorites. So I now have 3 favorites here. So what we're going to do now is go back to Sitecore, and we'll look at the user and look at the core database and see how that user was extended in the case of Launch Sitecore. So we're back here in Sitecore, and if we look at the user manager, we can see here now that I have this extranet user that was created, and that fully qualified name and my full name there, and I can double click on that and we can see the properties for that user. Now if I click on profile here, you can see that there's this additional properties, and it has data and favorites, and you can see that the 3 articles that I had selected in my favorites appear here in this list. And that's because in the Launch Sitecore implementation, they've extended those users in order to have these additional properties. And how they've done that is by going to the core database, and going to the security properties, and we have this Launch Sitecore user here, and you can see that that Launch Sitecore user is based upon the template Launch Sitecore user and has that additional favorites field there. And so basically they've simply inherited the regular user and added that favorites tree list, and they've set that so that it's the master database, and there's a data source and all that other information there as well. But that's really all you need to do to extend users within Sitecore. You can do this programmatically. You can easily create custom fields like favorites to receive that information on the fly. The only reason they've actually needed to extend this user within Sitecore is so that we can see that user when we look at the user manager and actually look at those properties. So now we're going to be accessing the data within this favorites field, and then we'll retrieve that data back and we'll use that for personalization. And so we're going to iterate through those 3 articles and create a Launch Sitecore book on the fly. But instead of iterating through all the articles, we'll just receive those pipeline delimited lists from this favorites field, and we'll simply create a book of the 3 articles. And that's our fairly simple starting point there. Next, we're going to go back to our Launch Sitecore book and make a copy of that PXM project. First things first, need to log back into our master database. And what we're going to do is take the existing book that we had and duplicate it and call it Launch Sitecore Articles on Demand. And say OK. And really what we're doing is we're stripping out the need to have that repeater that iterates through the chapters. And we're also going to remove the authors because we're really not dealing with a full book anymore. So we'll remove that. We will remove the table of contents. And then within our chapters, we're going to take this and promote that up to the top. That is no longer chapter, that is articles, or we could call that favorites. And then we're going to remove our chapters iterator. So we'll still have a cover, we'll still have an inside cover, and we will have favorites iterating through all of this content. As well, we can also remove this hidden text frame because that was used by the variables that were placed on the page in order to do that table of contents. So we don't need that either. So this is pretty much the project that we need now. We're going to call this, we're going to pass our list of favorites to our articles data key. So we're going to change this from chapters to articles. We're going to remove that item selector, and we still have article as our child. And so we're going to then iterate through the article singular, and this will produce all the list of articles within that favorites. So that's the first step. And then the second step is to actually make the code to call this project, as well as looking up the value of those favorites from the user profile. And so for that, we're going to go back to Visual Studio, and we're going to make some hooks in the user interface itself to call that. We're going to access the user profile, call the PXM Print Manager API, which will send all of this to InDesign Server to create that PDF, and then we'll redirect the user back to it. So we're back here in Visual Studio, and really the part of the Launch Sitecore site that we want to be manipulating is here. It's this My Favorites, and this is actually, if you track this back, stored in Layouts, Launch Sitecore, Controls, Navigation, Tertiary Nav. And so we're going to edit the ASCX file and the code behind as well. And so what we've got here in the ASCX was our list of favorites, and so we've inserted a basically a link button that calls our function. I want to do one more thing here now that I'm looking at the code for a second time. I'm going to insert a divider into that as well. So we'll put in that divider, and this is calling our button print click, which in turn is a function here. And so let's talk through what we're doing here. So first off, we're using sitecore.context.database.get item and this project item here, and this project path, and that project path is at the top of our code, and that is basically the path to our PXM project that we created. And we're simply accessing that as a Sitecore item now. So that is now a Sitecore item. We're also using sitecore.context.user and getting that user profile. Now the key to what we're doing here is, first of all, passing a parameter to our print options, and that parameter is passing this value to our articles data key. And what are we passing to the articles data key? Well, it's that list of favorites that's in the user profile, and we're using get custom property, and we're referencing favorites by name. And so what happens now is when that PXM project is being called, the articles data key will have this value passed to it. And then at that point, the repeater that's acting on that articles data key will iterate through those pipeline separated items. And so it's wonderful that repeaters will work with pipeline separated items, and it's wonderful that get custom property is storing that value as pipeline separated items. Now at this point here, we're calling the print manager, and this underlies basically any operation where you're communicating with InDesign Server. Now there are two operations here. There's print, and then there's also print async. And the difference is that print will create a new document on the fly, and we receive that result, and we redirect to that result as a PDF. And so we're receiving that immediately from InDesign Server and redirecting to that. What print async will do instead is it will actually create a new dashboard job. And what that will do is run that job in the background, and that's a background task, and the user will receive an email notification sent to them. Now, in this case here, I've decided to use print instead of print async, and the reason is that I haven't set up PXM to use an SMTP server, and that's going to be a pretty common configuration for anybody doing PXM development on their local machine. Obviously, in production, chances are you do have PXM talking to an email server to send out those emails, and in that case, you would probably want to use print async, because what that is doing is it is sending a job and it is using MSMQ and it is queuing those requests. And that is by far a more mission critical way of handling large number of print requests. So if there's a particularly high traffic period, those simply queue up in MSMQ requests, and InDesign Server and PXM will process through those as they go, and then during low traffic periods it will catch up and it will have those PDFs created and sent on demand. And so in this case here, like I said, we're going back to using Print Manager print, and that will create that PDF. We could also be doing some playing around with the naming here. We could be naming that off a user or any other format. In this case here, we're really just using the project item name and a date time to generate a unique file name. And so that's really all we're doing. And then last thing, we're taking that result and creating PDF MIME type response and transmitting that file. And so when the user comes to the Launch Sitecore site, they'll now have a new link here under My Favorites that will be Generate PDFs, and that will generate a PDF, send it to the PXM Print Manager, which is sending that to InDesign Server in real time, and get that PDF created, which is then redirected to them. So we'll do that. We'll build this and go back to the Launch Sitecore site and see the results. So before you do that, make sure that your newly created PXM project, Launch Sitecore Articles on Demand, is published to the web database. You can change that which database you're referencing. By default, you're often using the web database when it's kicking off a PDF on InDesign Server. You tend to just be using your current Sitecore context. You can specify web versus master here in what you're accessing, but typically speaking, you need to have a web database. Or actually here you can see we're using sitecore.context.database.getItem, so it's expecting it on the web, even though manually we're saying use the master. And the reason is sometimes there's information in the master that has been recently updated that you sometimes want to have, or you may be working with content that only exists in the master database. And so in this case here, we are switching context. We're using both master and web. And so you need to make sure that is published out. When that is published to the web database, you should then be able to go and navigate back to the Launch Sitecore site and look at your favorites here and say, generate a PDF of favorites. And this will process in the background, and it will create that new PDF based upon that naming convention that we have there in our tertiary nav code, and we'll say open, and you can see here we've got that PDF that was created, and it basically just iterates through the favorites that we have, as well as applying everything else that we have. So our custom image parser, all of our proper styles and that sort of thing is all coming through in that PDF that we have. Now the last thing that we're going to do is take this and add a bit of text on the cover page to say prepared for the username. And so we'll have this saying prepared for Mark Demany. So that way we know, yeah, this was the PDF that was made for me, personalized by PXM on the fly. And that's a very simple change. It's really a simple custom renderer. Again, we're just going to access the user profile, but instead of accessing the custom field favorites, we're just going to use full name and put that text in there and put that on the page. So we'll go back to InDesign, back to our PXM project, make that change, place that, and create that renderer and drop that into our code. So we're going back to InDesign here, and I'm going to access my newly created project there, that is Articles on Demand, and I'm going to load the cover page. And so you can see here I have my title. So I'm going to add a new static text block here. And put in a variable, and I'm going to line that up and basically take this and drag and drop that to my page there, my cover page. And so now I have that static text item there. And so I'm just going to call this personal message and say OK. And so what we're going to do now is put a custom renderer on this text frame, which will then take that $name and turn that into the name that's coming from the sitecore.user or sitecore.context.user. So once more, back to Visual Studio here, and within my PXM folder I have my renderers, and I'm going to drop in that renderer, and this is actually based off of the example that's in the Jetstream examples in the APS 1.4 solutions, and I've modified it slightly, basically just to format it a little bit differently, but that is about it. So I'm going to include that in the project, and so you can see here I'm accessing context.user.profile first name, and I'm doing that replacement. So I'm saying $name I'm going to replace with the user's name that is coming from the Sitecore user profile. And the only difference in the Jetstream one is it also does a replacement to do points value. So you have a loyalty program status, and that is it. And so we'll do a compile, and then we'll go to the process again in Sitecore itself of adding that as a renderer and applying that to the content on the page, and then we'll republish out our project and revisit it again in Internet Explorer. So the end result looks something like this. When you click on generate PDF of favorites, you now have a new field, a new text frame here that has prepared for Mark Demany. And all that's doing again is just pulling that full name value from the Sitecore user profile. And that is basically it. So, in general, no matter what you're doing with personalization, you're always accessing either a user or a contact in XDB. Obviously, you can only work with the information that you have. So if it's a user, certainly you'll have a lot more information because that is a logged in authenticated user. If it's just a contact, it may be anonymous. You may have some more information about them, but you can use what you have. And certainly you could even do personalization based upon anonymous visits, utilizing things like profile and pattern matching. But that gets a little complicated, certainly on the personalization side. But in the end, on the PXM side, it's very simple. You're just passing parameters to those data keys in order to determine what content gets slotted into what parts of that PXM project and then generated.